basic principles of taxation.
Taxation is an inherent power because this is an attribute of sovereignty. The basis of the power of taxation being inherent power is the lifeblood theory as well as the necessity theory, which posits that the very existence of the state is dependent upon tax revenues collected. Without taxes, the state would not be able to perform the functions for which it has been organized. The taxes are what we pay for this civilized society. As held by the Supreme Court in the case of Pepsi Cola Bottling Company versus Municipality of Tanawan Leyte, the power of taxation is essential and inherent attribute of sovereignty, belonging as a matter of right to every independent government without being expressly granted by the people. Whatever provisions in the Constitution relative to the state's power of taxation, these are not grants of power, but these are limitations on the state very broad power of taxation. Kung ano man po yung nasasaad sa ating saligang batas, partikular sa kapangyarihan ng gobyerno na maningil ng buwis, ito ay hindi pagkakaloob ng kapangyarihan sa ating gobyerno. Bagkus, ito ay mga limitasyon sa napakalawak na kapangyarihan ng ating gobyerno na impose ng buwis sa mga subjects ng taxation. The power of taxation is twofold in nature. This is inherent power and legislative power, with the primary purpose of fiscal or revenue, which means the primary purpose of the power of taxation is to raise revenues, to defray the necessary expenses of the government. If there would be ancillary functions or purpose of taxation, such as to regulate, compensatory, sumptuary, equality, in distribution of wealth, general promotion of general welfare, these are secondary purposes of taxation. Now, bear in mind that the primary purpose of the state's power of taxation is to raise revenues. Later on, we will make a delineation between the different inherent powers of the state, more particularly taxation, police power, and eminent domain. Bear in mind that the primary purpose of taxation is to raise revenues. Question: which one of the following is the primary purpose of taxation? Letter A, protection of local industries against foreign competition through imposition of high customs duties on imported goods. Although customs duties can be regarded as a form of tax, but nevertheless, the purpose for this is more on regulation, to regulate the inflow or entry of foreign articles in the market. Letter B, reduction of inequalities in wealth and income by imposing progressively higher tax rates. Now, perhaps this is secondary but not primary purpose. Letter C, to secure revenue for the support of the government. Yes. And letter D, strengthening of anemic enterprises by giving tax exemptions. What is our answer? Letter C, to secure revenue for the support of the government. Second question, the power of taxation can only be exercised by the lawmaking body. This is what? Letter A, subject to constitutional and inherent limitations. Letter B, equality or theoretical justice. Letter C, legislative in character. Letter D, inherent in sovereignty. What exemplifies the question? The power of taxation is essentially legislative that can only be exercised by the law-making body. Later we will discuss this. The underlying principles behind the power of taxation. Let us take this in both perspectives. Perspective of the taxpayer and the perspective of the government. As regards the government, first we have the principle of necessity. The existence of the government is a necessity, and it cannot continue without means to support itself. From this theory or principle, we can correlate the lifeblood doctrine. The lifeblood theory or doctrine provides that taxes are the lifeblood of the government, without which it can neither exist nor endure. Without money, the government cannot deliver services to the people or serve its function. On the other way around, if we are the taxpayer, we are expecting something in return from the government. And this is where the benefit receive theory sets in. The benefit receive theory provides that the government and the people have the reciprocal and mutual duties of support and protection to one another. This is dual in nature. This is also called as the symbiotic relationship of the government and the taxpayer. That we may be compelled as taxpayer to pay our taxes, but in return, we are expecting benefits from the government. That the government will serve its function. What are the inherent powers of the state? There are three inherent powers of the state: the power of taxation, police power, and the power of eminent domain. As we said, the power of taxation is essentially legislative in character, with the primary purpose of raising revenues in order to support the government operations. While police power is the power of the government to regulate, that is to promote the health, safety, or the general welfare of the people. While, on the other hand, eminent domain involves taking of private property for public use, and that is upon payment of just compensation. During the earlier times, we can make a delineation as to how the state exercise these three inherent powers by the very nature and characteristic of the State's Act. However, as times become more complicated, the state can perform an act, and this is in furtherance or as an implement or exercise of either or both or all of these inherent powers.
Distinctions between the three inherent powers. As to authority, taxation and police power can only be exercised by the government, while eminent domain can also be exercised by private entities engaged in public service or considered as public utilities. As to purpose, taxation, property is taken to support the government. This is generally payable in money. With respect to police power, the property is taken or destroyed to promote public welfare. And eminent domain, the property is taken for public use. As to persons affected, group or class of individuals are affected with respect to the exercise of taxation and police power, while only an individual or owner of particular property is affected with respect to eminent domain. As to effect, for taxation, what has been given to the state becomes part of public funds. For police power, there is restraint on injurious use of property, and there is no transfer of ownership. While eminent domain, There is transfer of right or ownership because the property will be taken for public use. And last, as to amount of imposition, the power of taxation is said to be unlimited. There is no limit on the amount of tax. While in case of police power, the amount is limited to cover the cost of license and expenses of regulation. In case of eminent domain, there is no imposition, and the property owner is paid the fair market value of the property taken. This is what we call as the just compensation.
Let us illustrate the inherent powers. Danilo owns a real property in Manila. He was then paying a real property tax. Mr. Lee made an offer to lease Danilo's property to be used as a merchandising store. They closed the deal and Danilo earns 25,000 pesos monthly rental income. Danilo and Mr. Lee were both required by the city government to apply for permit or license to operate the business. Danilo as a lessor and Mr. Lee as a merchandiser or businessman. Until some time, the property was expropriated by the city of Manila. Discuss the application of the inherent powers of the state. The imposition of the real property tax, as well as the income tax, the primary purpose of which is to raise revenues. And it is very clear that the government is exercising its power to tax. While the imposition of permit or license to operate the business is for regulatory purposes, so that the city government can monitor and regulate, control those businesses within its jurisdiction, to see to it that the businesses operating are lawful and in compliance with the law. Therefore, that is in furtherance of police power. Until the property was expropriated by the city of Manila. This is the state's exercise of eminent domain. But the property owner, and that is Danilo in this case, should be paid just compensation. And that is equivalent to the fair market value of the property. That is eminent domain. Let us have a more complicated example by using senior citizens discount as illustration. Mang Tolites is a senior citizen who purchases maintenance medicines from a drugstore. The selling price inclusive of value-added tax as per tag price is 500 pesos. This is inclusive of the 12% value-added tax. He was very happy when he was only charged the amount of 357 pesos and 14 centavos by the cashier. What particular inherent power or powers can we apply in this case? For our information, senior citizens are VAT exempt. They are not liable for the 12% VAT. And aside from that, they are given certain incentives, such as the 20% discount on their purchases and billable charges. How do we compute the 357 and 14 centavos billable amount? The selling price of 500 pesos, we will extract the VAT component by dividing the VAT rate. We have the 12% VAT, divide by 1.12 to get the VAT exempt sales. This is the gross selling price exclusive of the value-added tax. We will arrive at 146 or 446 and 43 pesos. And multiplied by the 20% discount, deduct it from the 446 and 43 centavos. Now, we will arrive at the billable amount of 357 pesos and 14 centavos. What particular inherent power or powers does the state exercise? In our mind, perhaps, we will say that the state is exercising police power because it is promoting the health and welfare of our senior citizens. And that is correct. But on the part of drugstores and business establishments, there were complaints because the government is taking their property and they are not being paid any compensation for that. And this is where the power of taxation sets in. The treatment on the 20% discount is allowable or was charged as allowable deduction from gross income of the taxpayer. Following the rulings of the Supreme Court, there were several rulings before the treatment is in the form of a tax credit. However, it is quite onerous on the part of the government, and that is the reason why in Central Luzon Drug Corporation versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the treatment now is to make it as an allowable deduction from gross income. This is one act of the state. However, the state is exercising this is being used as an implement not only of one inherent power, but likewise the other inherent powers as an implement of police power, at the same time the power of taxation. And we can consider the application also of the power of eminent domain, and that what makes our present times more complicated. Taxation is essentially legislative in character. We should not confuse ourselves with the powers or authority of the Bureau of Internal Revenue and the Bureau of Customs. Perhaps you will ask me, Ma'am, why is it that the BIR and the BOC are the agencies tasked in the collection of taxes and customs duties? And these agencies are under the Department of Finance, and the Department of Finance is under the executive branch, under the office of the President. There are three aspects or process in taxation. First is the levy aspect, that there must be a law which imposes the tax. And subsequently, after the enactment of the law, it is where the executive department implements or executes the law. The assessment and collection is vested with the Bureau of Customs or the Bureau of Internal Revenue, depending on the kind of tax or imposition. But of course, this is, we are referring to the national taxes. Now, how about the judiciary? The Court of Tax Appeals and the Supreme Court, with reference only to tax cases, elevated on appeal, decides on tax cases. Judicial decisions are considered as source of tax laws. Always remember and do not be confused. If the problem is silent, taxation is essentially legislative in character because we are referring to the levy aspect of taxation. And only legislature can enact tax laws. Question. The following are similarities of the inherent power of taxation, eminent domain, and police power, except one. We are referring to the distinction. Letter A, are necessary attributes of sovereignty. This is similarity. That is not the answer. Letter B, affect all persons or the public. This is not a similarity. This is distinction. Taxation and police power affect all persons or the public, but not in the case of eminent domain. Letter C, interferes with private rights and property. This is similarity. Letter D, are legislative in character. All of the inherent powers are legislative in character. Our answer, letter B, affect all persons or the public. Second question, police power as distinguished from taxation. Our choice or answer should correlate with police power. Letter A, just compensation is received by the owner of the property. This is irrelevant to the question because this refers to eminent domain. Letter B, may be exercised by private individuals. This also refers to eminent domain. Letter C, superior to non-impairment clause of the Constitution. We will see. Letter D, property is taken by the government for public purpose. This is for eminent domain. Now, our answer is letter C. The provision regarding no law impairing obligations and contracts shall be passed is a constitutional limitation on the exercise of the power of taxation. Thus, taxation is inferior to the non-impairment clause of the Constitution. However, the exercise of police power can override the non-impairment clause. Again, I repeat, taxation is inferior to the non-impairment clause of the Constitution because this is one of the constitutional limitations, while police power is superior and can override the non-impairment clause of the Constitution. Our answer, letter C. Another question. After having been informed that some massage parlors are being used as fronts for prostitution, the Sangguniang Panlungsod of Manila passed a tax ordinance subjecting massage parlors within its jurisdiction to such onerous taxes that leave them no other alternative but to stop operating. I think this happened during the time of Mayor Alfredo Lim. The passage of ordinance is a valid exercise of what? Inherent power. Now, this is in the exercise of the power of taxation, imposition of onerous taxes, with another purpose, the regulatory purpose. And when we talk of regulatory purpose, we are also referring to the police power of the state. Our answer in this case, this is in furtherance or as an implement of both police power and power of taxation. Letter D. Another question. Which statement refers to police power as distinguished from taxation? Our answer should refer to police power. Letter A. It can only be imposed on specific property or properties. This is for what? Eminent domain. Letter B. The amount imposed depends on whether the activity is useful or not. Yes, this is for police power. Letter C. It involves the taking of property by the government. This is eminent domain. Letter D. The amount imposed has no limit. The limited amount, this is for taxation. Our answer, letter B. The amount imposed depends on whether the activity is useful or not. Sources of tax laws. First, we have the Constitution. The provisions of the Constitution dealing on taxation merely regulate the exercise of the power of taxation. These are not actually grants of power because taxation can be exercised by the government and the power of taxation is not a mere constitutional grant. But tax laws, as well as administrative rulings and regulations, all must be consistent with our Constitution. Next, we have the statutory enactments, which refers to the tax laws passed by Congress. In relation to this, we can also refer to administrative rulings and regulations. Administrative rulings are the less general interpretation of tax laws which are issued from time to time by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. They are usually rendered on request of taxpayers to clarify certain provisions of tax law. These are commonly known as BIR rulings. Revenue regulations are intended to clarify or explain the law and carry into effect its general provisions by providing the details of administration and procedure. Kumbaga po, ito ay mga implementing rules and regulations. And in case of conflict between a regulation and a statute, the statute shall prevail. Regulations issued by the Secretary of Finance upon the recommendation of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue are known as the revenue regulations. Last, we have the judicial decisions. This refers to the decisions of the Court of Tax Appeals and the Supreme Court applying or interpreting tax laws. They constitute major part of jurisprudence on taxation and form part of the legal system of the Philippines. Decisions of Court of Tax Appeals, however, are still appealable to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And the decisions of the Supreme Court are the ones considered as binding precedent. Question. Statement 1. In case of conflict between the revenue regulation and the provisions of the National Internal Revenue Code, the latter shall prevail. This is correct. We are referring to the NIRC or the law. And let us rank it accordingly. First, we have the Constitution, which is the fundamental law of the land. Next, the statutory enactments in the form of our tax laws. The Supreme Court decisions can be taken into consideration by Congress in the enactment of tax laws. And last, we have the BIR rulings and revenue regulations. The rulings and regulations must be consistent with the law, in the same way that the law must be consistent with the Constitution. Statement 1 is correct. Statement 2. The revocation of a revenue regulation cannot be made retroactive even if the reason for its revocation is that it is erroneous or contrary to law. I would like to give emphasis that anything that is contrary to law is without legal effect. And in this case, the revocation of the revenue regulation, how can a revenue regulation, a ruling, or even a law for that matter, be declared as without legal effect or be revoked? By filing a case before the courts, assailing the validity of the BIR ruling or the revenue regulation or even the particular law. Now, in this case, this can be applied retroactive. Now, we should also not confuse ourselves with the application of tax laws. Tax laws are generally prospective in application. In this case, we are not referring to tax laws. This is revocation of a revenue regulation for being contrary to law. Our answer, letter A. Statement 1 is true and statement 2 is false. Interpretation of tax laws. As a general rule, tax laws are construed liberally in favor of the taxpayer and strictly against the government. An exception to this rule, tax exemptions and deductions are strictly construed against the taxpayer and liberally in favor of the government. This is quite confusing. For easy recall, para matandaan natin ng madali, you just memorize one. Perhaps that would be the general rule. If you're referring to tax laws, liberally in favor of the taxpayer and strictly construed against the government. The so-called rule on strictissimi juris applies to the exception. For exemptions and deductions, you just reverse the general rule that it is strictly construed against the taxpayer and liberally in favor of the government. Again, I repeat, i-memorize lang natin ang isa, ang reverse of that general rule is the exception. Tax laws, then tax exemptions, and deductions. Tax amnesty is distinguished from tax exemption. Both amnesty and exemption are grants of immunity, which means that the taxpayer is forgiven by the state to pay his supposedly tax or even penalties. But how do we distinguish? Tax amnesty is a general pardon, or the intention overlooking by the state of its authority to impose penalties on persons otherwise guilty of violation of a tax law. Tax amnesty is granted to a taxpayer who already violated the tax law. It partakes of an absolute waiver by the government of its right to collect what is due to it, and to give tax evaders who wish to relent a chance to start with a clean slate. Tax amnesty can be applied retroactively, and it applies not only to civil, but as well as civil, or should I say criminal, and administrative penalties. Now, while tax exemptions are applied prospectively, and the application is with reference only to the civil aspect. Question 1. In case of ambiguity, the tax laws shall be interpreted. Isn't it? In case of doubt, tax law shall be interpreted liberally in favor of the taxpayer and strictly against the government. Our answer is letter C. Second question, the factor except 1 are exceptions to the rule that tax exemptions must be strictly construed against the taxpayer. Yun, no? We have our exception in case of construction, in case of ambiguity, in tax exemptions and deductions. When does the rule of strictissimi juris applies in tax exemptions and tax deductions? The following are exceptions to this interpretation, except letter A, where the statute granting the exemption provides for liberal interpretation thereof. This is an exception to the rule of strictissimi juris in case of interpretation of tax exemption. This is exception and this is not the answer. Letter B, if the taxpayer does not fall within the purview of the exception by clear legislative intent. Now, the rule on strictissimi juris applies for the claim of tax exemption. Perhaps this may be the answer. Letter C, in case of special taxes relating to special cases and affecting only special classes of persons. This is exception to the rule on strictissimi juris. Letter D, if exemptions refer to public property. Actually, this is one of the inherent limitations. Okay, our answer? Letter B. If the taxpayer does not fall within the purview of the exception by clear legislative intent.
See you in the next part of our discussion.